Please welcome to the stage then Nick Rivero and Joshua Eason from Maptic. Welcome, guys.
Thank you. Well, we are very excited to be here at NotchCon this year. And as I already said and introduced myself, my name is Nick Rivero. I am the co-founder of Maptic. And
Josh Eason, interactive designer, mostly in Notch.
So today we wanted to tell you a little bit about kind of some stuff we work on, which is brand-centric world, how we fit brands' creative needs within Notch. And what we're going to do is we're going to show kind of a case study of 4 projects that we've worked on. And Josh is actually going to show you some of the Notch project files and kind of explain a little bit about some of the things we've done, some of the things we deal with. So as I kind of said, just to give you a little bit of background, who we are at Maptic, is we are an experiential design agency, and we say that our mission is to craft immersive experiences that inspire wonder and bring people together. What that actually looks like is it kind of breaks down into 4 areas of our company and what we do, which is technical design and on-site support, so actually making shows happen. We have a background in large format motion design, so we were doing traditional pre-rendered motion design already, but we never touched really anything like broadcast or web-based. Everything we did was large-scale, stage-based visuals. Then we get into really Josh's area, which is interactive and real-time technology. So we try to figure out how can we better engage people through the use of technology. And then this kind of derivative over here, which you'll see some of the work we do, is we actually get into design and building things. So a lot of times we'll get contracted for a trade show booth, and we'll design the entire thing from the ground up, the technology, the idea, and then we'll actually fabricate and build the pieces. So let's jump in here about brands and their needs. The things I would say about typically working with brands, and particularly in our case, we're speaking into corporate brands, is they typically have strict guidelines. So a lot of times, as you're going to see here, they come to us with preconceived notions of things and how they want things to look to match their style. A lot of brands have very specific shades of reds and blues and greens that you have to adhere to and you can't deviate from. And as I say here, a lot of times we can't deviate. So if they hand us a concept, we can't make a right turn and say, well, you gave us circles, we like squares better. But what we can do is we can iterate, is we can take the circle and say, what if we do multiple circles or different things like that? And then the other thing is a lot of times in these processes, is a lot of you might be used to, is we get tons and tons of layers of approval. So people have to sign off and they have to see things. So we can't just kind of go off in left field. Now, what matters to these clients typically is the first part, which is how do we deliver a product that's indistinguishable from what they already know? And as I said, as a studio, we came from a background in a lot of traditional motion design. So as we started introducing Notch, clients already had an expectation of what you could do with your After Effects and your Cinema 4Ds. So we had to meet that need as a baseline to then start moving forward, which is the next question, which is how does Notch then benefit them? And as you're going to see in these projects, we were able to come in, meet those needs, and then say, well, what else could we do? What's the next thing we could do to that? With what we're going to look at here really quickly is how we meet the brands and how we innovate, but what we want to share a little bit about is in the projects that we do, and Josh is going to talk about, is some of the projects were created entirely in Notch. Some of the projects were Notch, and then we would composite them externally using something like After Effects, and then some of them we actually do a combination of Cinema 4D plus Notch. Now, one thing I'm going to say is we're probably doing this wrong, and we're up here to share our perspective of how we do things, and that's what's really exciting about software like this is we all have our different ways to find a solution. So that's what we're up here going to share. So let's jump into the first project right here that we're going to talk about, and that is a project we worked on for Amazon last year. And it's the Amazon, as I mentioned, this is the finished show, which is a little bit hard to see, but it was a show for their sellers, for people selling products on Amazon and things like that, showing some of the original renderings. But when they came to us, this pattern and all these arrows and things was really kind of, as I mentioned, already a pre-designed thing. But what I want Josh to touch on is we made something so simple, and as you can kind of see in this little animation in the background, these little elements, just these little turning lines, were an idea that was possible in Notch. And so I want Josh to explain a little bit of how he kind of built that.
Yeah, hey, so basically, you know, again, coming from a motion graphics background, we said, oh, we can render this out, we can render this out. But, I mean, as you can tell, it's a bunch of the same lines, not just cloners. So we said we can build a toolkit instead. And really that's kind of our new approach is, well, do you want the same thing over and over again? Does it only need to look a little bit different in each iteration, each section of a show? And if so, we can build a tool set in Notch so that maybe the lines are white one time, maybe the lights will be yellow the next time. We can then very easily change animation speed, or maybe the speaker is going to come up, it needs to take 20 seconds, but we get on site and they go, is there any way you can cut that down to 10 seconds? Now those kinds of things are possible.
Yeah, so that kind of segues us into our next show. And this is an unnamed show that I can't really speak of, but to show you some pictures of that we worked on. And this show in particular looks very simple. It's red and white lines, but what I can't really tell you enough about is the amount of detail that this client had in adhering to what those lines looked like. So this is a project that we went into creating this pretty much entirely in Notch, and we actually ran the show inside of Notch as Notch blocks. And so, whoops, jumping back. So in this, as you can see in this brand guide, they gave us very specific direction about what these lines should look like, how these lines should appear, the rigidness of the lines, color palettes of the lines, and different things like that we had to play with. Not only that, they gave us very strict guidelines on the motion of how the lines had to animate in and out. So I actually wanted Josh to do here was kind of jump in and show a little bit of not only how he built them, but a really interesting idea about how he built the retiming of the animations, because that's a really big part of corporate shows is things, a lot of times you have a speaker walks on, so something animates on, then the speaker's there, then it animates off. So he came up with a really interesting solution to that.
All right, there it is. And since we don't have a ton of time to kind of get into complete depth in these projects, if any of y'all have any questions on these techniques, definitely feel free to find me afterwards. But basically, the idea with this one was that we could create this line pattern in Notch, be able to pick where does it start, where does it land, and where does it end up, without using any keyframes at all, and being able to have a single slider that says 0, be off screen, 1, be on screen, and then back to 0 to reverse it. And then within our media server, then we could retime that animation on the fly based on the needs of the client. So this is the node graph. Pretty simple, really. And there's the animation on. And then it settles. And then it's just can hang out there as long as it needs to. And then just with one value, take it off screen. And so there's a lot of power behind that, because it gives us a ton of flexibility on site of, oh, we're behind schedule, this, that, or the other. We can just retime these things on the fly. So with this one, again, there's no keyframes at all. So basically, I'm just going to show you. I've got a envelope modifier that gets fed into a series of range remaps. And these range remaps, the lower value is where the animation starts off. The high value is where the animation ends up. And then you can just go 0 to 1, and then it goes from, on each one of those values, any value that you want to control, you can take it from where you started to where you need to go and reverse it. It creates a, no real assets, I don't think, in this file at all. Oh, not that one, because there's other things in here. But everything is completely generated in Notch, and therefore you have a ton of flexibility because everything can be manipulated in Notch.
Yeah, so one of the other kind of side effects in talking about this being in Notch that we were able to do is we could actually make parts of it audio reactive. So in this case, this is one of those things where the client came to us in the middle of kind of on site and said, can you make those lines audio reactive? And we said, actually, we can. So kind of an unintended consequence of this being in Notch. So jumping ahead into a project, another project, this is a corporate client we work with in Atlanta. It's a local event called Leadercast. It's a one-day leadership event. And this year, what we actually did is kind of interesting. As you can see in these pictures, what you're actually looking at is the set. And the set is made of LED panels. But the entire set is just a flat wall. So you kind of see that it looks like there's like these kind of shadow boxes, these screens that extrude, and these different polygon pieces that sit in the set. All of that is just a singular flat LED wall. But this is entirely run in Notch, but it was with some elements built in Cinema 4D, then brought in Notch. As you can see, we based the idea wholly off of their brand this year, which was these kind of shards. And then we worked with the set designer to kind of build this out. But in final the kind of final pieces you can see is we actually tied the whole thing together, is that the set was actually part of the speaker's animation. So as the speaker was walking on, we could play this, and then it would animate actually into the finished set piece that they would sit and watch as the speaker talked. Now, one of the big key pieces about this show is it's a broadcast show, and it gets broadcast to companies like Apple and UPS around the world and whatnot. But the client is very, very, very meticulous about colors, because there was an incident a couple of years ago where the colors did not look really good on camera and on broadcast, and that was a huge pain point. And so by us introducing Notch to this, you can see how I just changed from a bluish teal palette to a red and gray. Those were key frameable parameters that we added on site. So the night before the show, we actually sat with the broadcast truck engineers looking through the lens of the camera, and we would actually dial the colors in. So the colors were not predetermined until we got on site and actually said, okay, that red is too red. We need to back that down. Blue, more blue. We like teal, and those kind of things. So again, Josh, give me a little bit of kind of insight into what we did here.
So this is kind of similar to the last technique, but in this case, you take in this case, it was an FBX that we took out of Cinema 4D. One of our motion designers rendered out that animation of how, or not rendered out, but gave keyframes to build an animation of how those shards should form. You then could take that FBX into Notch, and there's a nice little plug at the bottom of, I think it's right there, called LWS Time Control. And with that, you can use an envelope modifier or any other kind of modifier to basically scrub back and forth through an animation. So in this case, we said at 0, the animation starts, and at 1 is where the animation ends up. And so then on site, even though it's a keyframed animation, you have complete rescalability of the time and how quickly that animation takes place on site. So you can control the time now, control the color, and even the lighting. We actually didn't end up doing it, but we had it exposed so that the lighting designer could match the lighting of the Notch scene with his actual lights on the stage to really integrate the scene into the room.
Yeah. If you want to play through that.
Oh yeah, sorry, meant to do that.
Just on the animation. So as you can see, like Josh said, that was built in Cinema 4D, and then we could retime that animation, showing you that come together.
Yeah, LWS time control.
So jumping into kind of our last project here is a project we got to do for AT&T, big cellular carrier in the US, in an event they call Super Saturday Night, which is the night before the Super Bowl. So we were up in Minneapolis last year in this building on the right called the Armory, just about a block away from the Super Bowl. And what we actually worked on was this huge in-room experience. So AT&T throws this huge pre-Super Bowl party. And what we actually had the chance to do this year is basically turn every piece of content in the venue into Notch. And the reason we really did that is to make it audio reactive, to make an incredible experience. So this event has artists like Pink and J-Lo and Imagine Dragons, but also has DJs. So it's a whole night full of music. So during that, we really wanted to build something that just really enhanced the experience, and we thought, well, audio activity is kind of perfect for this. But in working with this, AT&T has very strict guidelines, so probably the strictest, because what actually happened is not only did they deliver us a typical brand guide telling us colors, telling us what things should look like, they actually handed us complete finished Cinema 4D files. So what you're seeing right here is the actual finished piece of work is they handed over to us, here's a C4D file, textures, everything done. And they said, now, take that and make that audio reactive. So we didn't have a lot of control, and that's why I said this is a perfect project of iteration versus creation, is we had to take that and then say, well, let's present you some ideas for how we could do that. So I'm going to show you some of kind of what that turned into, and then let Josh talk a little bit about the piece. But this was one of them, and this was actually, this was the finished rendered piece. So to give you an idea of what we were up against, this is what they sent us for this piece to look like. It was pretty gorgeous. These 3D flowers with this wireframe S for Saturday. Really impressive piece. So it was our job then to take that and then basically rebuild it in Notch and make it audio reactive. So one of the pieces in the kind of core piece was this one. So one thing, so what you can see is we've rebuilt this entirely in Notch to be audio reactive. And then we added a little bit different context because this was being played in a room with DJs and things. We wanted to be able to have more flashier elements and brighter elements, and AT&T ended up being okay with that. We also ended up deviating to some different scenes that Josh came up with. So taking the same motif and building off of that, and again, building audio reactivity into that. and then another scene. So as we're running out of time, I'll just go ahead and jump into the notch thing. And what I want Josh to talk about is some interesting things he built in this. Is not just audio reactivity. He brought in 3D elements, and a huge piece of this project was optimization, because just because you make something in Cinema 4D does not mean that it's good, those models are going to run well in Notch. And this was a huge one to that, is Josh had to do a lot of optimization in those models to get them to be more performant so we could get our frames per second up. And then the other interesting thing is that he can explain about this camera switching system he built.
Yeah, so when the client gave us the assets, the poly count on those flowers was absurd, like so much higher than it even needed to be for their purposes. So I probably did like a, 90% reduction of the poly count. And really what you learn in real time is that you have to rely more on lower poly models, but then using normal maps and things like that to smooth it out, enabling the tessellation features in Notch. To get really the same results, or almost the same results as you would in, with a crazy high poly count. So optimization, tons of time was spent on optimizing for the client and for this project. But this project is more of your standard audio reactive setup. And by the way, also, just because I'm OCD about this, I would suggest any time in Notch when you're working, because with clients you have to do quick iterations, have your node graph laid out in pretty much the same way in every project, because then you always know where your stuff is when you go back to it. So I mean, in this case, I always do lights and cameras up here. I always do post effects over here, and my scene's always over here. So it's always the same. Big suggestion. But what Nick was saying, there's a camera switching system that we built. There's this wonderful node that I love map for called the child select node. And basically, we just have a sound modifier that's, you can ignore the quantize modifier. It does something, but it doesn't really matter here. And we're going to a accumulator. So basically, you just like bump, bump, bump with audio, and that's building up an accumulator. Goes into an envelope modifier set to modulo, and it says every time you hit the 4, go back to 0. That goes into this child selector node. The child selector node, what it allows you to do is it'll say, okay, when you're at 0, grab this selection of nodes. 1s, grab this selection of nodes, so on and so on. So as the beat goes on and pushes the sound modifier, you're automatically changing cameras on the beat. It's quite effective to give variety to your scenes. And then I have some math modifiers in here to give the camera animation. Again, no keyframes. I try to never use keyframes if I can help it, actually. You can do so much more in Notch that way, my opinion.
Yeah. So I kind of say that kind of wraps the bulk of our talk, and we wanted to open up to any questions you guys might have.
Including tech questions?
Yeah, technical
Sure.
or otherwise.
Just still trying to figure out how you got that. What's the accumulator?
It's the accumulator. It just builds up. It never stops. It just keeps going. So if you,
Continuous? Or?
it's kind of like a continuous modifier. So if you set the default value on it here, value to 1, I believe it's every second, but I think that it would just go up 1 unit every second, or some value of time.
So that would be your
Right.
toggle between the...
But if you leave it at 0 and then you push information into it from the sound modifier, then it's just accumulating based on every positive hit of the sound modifier. And you could set it so it takes negative hits too. But in that case, we just wanted to build up, and then I'm using a modulo to then make it just continuously wrap 0, 1, 2, 3, wrap, 0, 1, 2, 3, wrap. And that way, it's just going through each camera. Now, you could set it into like a math modifier set to random with a really, really low speed, so it was randomly picking the camera. But in this case, we wanted it to go linearly.
Questions? One is also technical about this, the child select. So you're on camera 6, and just change camera 6 each time, kind of thing?
Yeah, so the 4 cameras here, and then also on a note on that, you have to select your current camera to current playing camera, otherwise it won't automatically switch. It'll be on the manual camera. But with that, you can make it switch based on the child select.
Second question was, so first of all, it's really beautiful.
Oh, thank you.
And I really like the optimization, so it's just like working automatically on the beat and it's changing on the beat. Do you guys ever think of making a system where a VJ would work on it and kind of like, have knobs and sliders and whatever, instead of having an accumulator speed, is that like a very, is it Safari and
Yeah.
Right.
So let me reiterate that question. So instead of building an automatic system to switch the cameras, have we used like VJ controllers, MIDI controllers, or things like that?
And yeah, definitely. So in a lot of cases, I want to get a scene to work automatically as much as possible, but then have a MIDI controller that can handle blackouts, or maybe have a strobe or like a drum crash out or something like that, or any other thing that I could foresee that we might want to change mid-show to add that extra level of flair. Because I mean, if this played continuously, it's going to be unique to every song based on what song's playing, but it's going to look repetitive after a while, no matter how many different camera angles and things like that you put in there. So yeah, adding some human control on top of it is always a good idea.
Yeah. You got in the back.
Did you run this directly from Notch? So I'm curious what your resolution was. It looks like a really nice scene. How you got over it.
Yeah, the question was, did we run this from Notch? And the answer is yes. We actually ran this across multiple outputs across multiple servers. I think in the end it was 5 servers running basically the whole venue. So we had a feed that would feed just like all the TVs behind the bars, and we had a feed that would feed the stage and the ceiling, and then there were some other things like a DJ booth, and then there was another room with a bunch of projection in it. So we kind of broke it up into different zones. So each one of those resolutions wasn't more than, I would argue, even 1080, like 1920, 1080 at most.
But I mean, resolution doesn't have to stop you. I mean, my workflow with pretty much any of these types of scenes is I build the scene to look how I want it to look, and try not to worry too much about FPS, but always keeping optimization in mind. And then in the end, I kind of just go and I toggle off a node. I go, okay, what's killing my FPS? What's killing my FPS? And after a while, you start to learn which nodes are FPS killers and which ones are not, and good practices and bad practices. But still, every single project, I'll go and I'll toggle nodes off and I'll figure out what's killing my FPS. And then I'll say, well, is it really helping me that much? And if it's not, I might just delete that node. And and anytime you build a scene, try to build the scene with as few nodes as possible. Because, I mean, if you don't need it, why have it in the scene? It's just eating up resources.
And I should say, when we started building this, you actually had kind of what you're saying is you had nodes in it that we ended up taking out to gain higher performance because it wasn't running to kind of a standard we wanted to.
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of time, like Nick was saying in that last talk, a lot of the time that we spend is not in rendering, but it's in optimization. It's sometimes you have to say, well, that's a cool effect, but it's killing our FPS, so we might try something different and change things based on performance, not only based on aesthetics.
Okay, so I'm gonna play you guys off like the Oscars.
Run behind.
Only to play you back on, because these guys are also going to have the next talk, which is called something else, which is where Nick gets to be silly. And this is where you were taking off your shirts, wasn't that the deal?
That's the
Yeah,
deal.
that was the deal.
That's the deal. All right. So we just keep chugging on.
Yeah.
All right.
Walking off the stage.
Give a big hand
not
to
true.
Nick and Josh.
Yeah, hold on.